culture and difference than what we have today for a funeral. None of the stuff that I just read you sounds like a typical funeral nowadays. It's very different. But I think you can observe some principles of what were happening then in their culture and apply them now to our culture. First of all, Jacob's death is reported in verses 29 to 33. And I want you to notice that Jacob gave his sons burial instructions. That still happens today. There are many people who come. Now, you have to understand, there are some people who die suddenly, and some people who die what I would call progressively, knowing that their death is imminent. Does that make sense to you? There are some people who die of a heart attack and they didn't know they were going to die. Well, not them. There are some people who die of a shooting and they didn't know they were going to die. But there are some people who are sick for a longer period of time and they know that death is imminent. And for those people especially if their wits are about them, they still have memory and cognition. For those people, it's very often a very special thing for them to think about how they would like to be remembered. And to write it down. And to instruct their family. Very many times I've been at memorial services that have actually been planned by the person who we're memorializing. And that has been a very beautiful thing. So Jacob gave his instructions, his son's instructions for his burial. He knew that he was about to die, and I want you to notice that statement there, I'm about to be gathered to my people. Do you see that? He repeats that statement at least twice in this text. And I want to talk to you for just a minute about what it means. It means two things. To be gathered to my people, he was thinking that his parents, his grandparents, those were his people, and to be gathered to his people meant that he was going to be brought up into eternity to be with his loved ones who were in glory. I'm about to be gathered to my people. But it also meant something physical here on this earth. It meant that in those days it was special to them to be buried in a family plot. And for him to be gathered to his people meant that he would be buried where his father and mother and grandfather and grandmother were buried. This kind of is real to me because there's a special spot in Manitoba where a church was many years ago, and that's where my grandparents are buried. That's where many of my aunts and uncles are buried. That's where my father is buried. And I don't know. It's possible that I might be buried there sometime, but it's also possible that I'll be buried in Reedley with Miriam's parents and their family. It's just a matter of where we are at the time of passing. But very often in the Bible days, being buried with your family was significant. So, to be gathered to my people means to be gathered to heaven and to be gathered to the place of burial. So, Jacob knew what was going to happen. And he gave his sons instructions of what he wanted. Bury me with my fathers. And this goes back to, his mind goes back to the time in Genesis 23 when his grandpa Abraham purchased a field because his grandma Sarah had just died. And he purchased the field because he wanted a cave that was in that field. And that cave was the place of burial for Abraham and Sarah, for Isaac and Rebekah, and now for Jacob. And I want you to notice not Rachel, but Leah. Rachel was born in Bethlehem, remember? Like we talked about before. So this was the cave, this was the family burial place, and that's where he wanted to be. Verse 33, after Jacob gave these instructions, it says something very beautiful. He drew up his feet into his bed. In other words, he wasn't walking anymore. After that, he was going to be bedridden. He breathed his last, and he was gathered to his feet. So Jacob had made the instructions early enough, and then he knew it was time. He wasn't going to be able to get up and be around anymore. And then he died, and he was gathered to be with his people. So that's Jacob's death reported. Number 2, a time of mourning took place in Egypt. Remember, Jacob had come to Egypt to meet with Joseph. And the last 17 years of his life, Jacob was in Egypt. He lived 147 years. And Joseph and Jacob became very close in those last 17 years. And I want you to see how Joseph acted when his father died. Verse 1 of chapter 50. Joseph expressed his grief. He threw himself on his father. He wept over him, and he kissed him. Listen to me carefully. All of us are going to go through this experience sometime or another. You do not have to hide your feelings and your emotions of sadness and loss. It is appropriate for believers in God to sorrow. And I want to quickly say, added to that, but we do not sorrow as those who have no hope. We do sorrow. I remember where I was the day my dad died. Do you know where I was? I was in a church business meeting. And I was called on the phone. And you know what I did? I asked somebody else to take over. I left. And I drove to Winnipeg as fast as I could. I didn't break the speed limit, but I drove as fast as I could. And as I was driving to Winnipeg, the tears were just streaming down my face. I could hardly control myself. It's okay to mourn. I've met some people, I'll give you an example. One of the leaders of our church, the first church I pastored, told his wife he wanted no crying at his funeral. And I talked to his wife after his passing, and I said, you know what? He meant well. But for your health, you're going to have to let yourself cry. Because it's part of the human makeup that when we lose somebody dear to us, I believe that mourning is an expression of love. If you loved somebody and they are taken away from you, you're going to be sad. We mourn, but we do not mourn as those without hope. Let's not forget that. So Joseph expressed his grief, and then Joseph directed his physicians to embalm his father. And this is quite different than anything we've heard of recently. The embalming took 40 days. Can you imagine that? It almost makes me wonder, well, why was Joseph so insistent that his dad be embalmed? And the answer was easy. The answer is easy to find. If they are going to take Jacob's body from Egypt to the field in Canaan that was purchased for his burial, it was going to take several days of a trip to go there. In the Middle East, if a body has passed away, they bury them immediately. If they don't embalm them, they bury them the same day that they die, because that's how quick the body decays in the hot weather over there in the Middle East. But if they want to have a procession, like a cross-country procession, they need to embalm them so that they will be able to make the trip healthy. The other thing that they needed to do was Egyptians embalmed better than anybody else did because they wanted to have mummies. And we have well, when I was in seminary, we went as a class to San Francisco, and we saw the remains of King Tut and his sarcophaguses, I think they call it. And we saw 4,000-year-old mummies who were amazingly preserved. Well, that's kind of back like it was in the time of Egypt. So it took them 40 days to embalm him. Then it was probably 30 days later. During the 40 days they were mourning, and 30 more days they kept on mourning, so that the Egyptians mourned for him for 70 days. What was Jacob to the Egyptians? Simply, he was the father of Joseph. They revered Joseph as the man who was able to take them through the famine. So they revered his father, Jacob, as the man who raised such a wonderful son who could lead them. So the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. First of all, they prepared for his death. They mourned him for 70 days. And now, number 3, Jacob's burial is reported, chapter 50, verse 4 to 14. Joseph had asked for permission to leave Egypt. I find this fascinating. You know why? Remember who Joseph was. He was the second in command in all of Egypt. So who did he ask permission from? The first in command, Pharaoh. Wouldn't it be, well, I think it would be quite often logical for a man who's in the second position to think, I don't have to ask permission of anybody. I'm just going to go do what I want to do. That's the kind of way we think in America. I don't have to ask anybody. I'm just going to do it. I don't ask permission. I ask for forgiveness. You know, that's the kind of attitude we sometimes have. But Joseph was a godly man, and he recognized there was somebody that he should ask, and that was Pharaoh. And he asked in a kind of roundabout way. He asked politely through the servants of Pharaoh. He asked the servants of Pharaoh to ask Pharaoh. And after that was done, Pharaoh gave permission. It was all fine. But he also made the promise, verse 5, I will return. See, this could have been a wonderful escape for the small family of Jacob. They could have said, well, the famine's over. Well, Joseph's responsibilities are almost over. Therefore, we could split Egypt and not have to suffer any problem. They didn't know that the problems were coming. But that could have been a possibility of how somebody would think. But they didn't. Because Joseph promised, we're not going to leave you in the lurch. You've hired us to take care of the flocks. We're going to keep on taking care of the flocks. We're going to be responsible people. We just need time to go bury my father, and then we will return. And the fact that he promised to return and that he kept his promise to return was a sign of the responsibility that Joseph had taken upon himself. When we make our promises, folks, we need to come through with them. We need to be people of integrity. Pharaoh gave him permission. Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do. So Joseph led a group to the family burial site, verse 7 to 9. I wanted you to notice that Joseph didn't go alone. It says he went up to bury his father, but it also says that Pharaoh's officials accompanied him. The level of a state funeral. So high was the respect of Pharaoh for his second in command, having led the people through the difficult time of 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, and God had given Joseph so much wisdom in doing that, and Pharaoh respected Joseph so highly that he elevated his dad's funeral to a state procession. So Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, and all the members of Joseph's household came too. His brothers and their families came too. And I want you to see this. Only the children stayed home to care for the flocks. Now, I want you to be encouraged how to think about this. We're not talking about 4 and 5-year-olds left home to take care of the sheep. We're talking about older children who were able to take care of the sheep, just like David took care of the sheep, and we're not thrilled about going to a funeral. So we're talking about older children and the sheep were left behind, and they were going to be able to take care of themselves, and the older in the family went to mourn and be part of this funeral procession. And it says in the text it was a very large company. And then it was a time of mourning at the site of the burial. And I want you to see what they did. They lamented loudly. I don't know if you've ever been at a funeral where there are people who are lamenting. But I want to say this with respect. Some of our Catholic friends have funerals where they get very loud in lamenting their loved ones. And I'm not sure if that's a bad thing. I think that's an okay thing to do. I'm not sure that people should be hired to lament, but because that seems a little bit incongruous. You're not really lamenting because you miss them. But if somebody in the family or friends genuinely misses somebody, lamenting loudly is okay. I've talked to many families just before we walk in with the casket. You know, I'm a pastor, and they often have me walk before the casket. The casket follows me, and behind the casket is the family. And as I walk into a church like that, just before we get in, I have a word of prayer with the family. And I say, listen, folks, this service is not for the people that are in the church. They've come to support you. This service is not for your departed loved one. They're in heaven already. This service is for you. If something is said in the service that helps you laugh, laugh. If something in the service is said that causes you to cry, cry. Because this is the time for you to mourn and rejoice and identify with what God is doing through taking a loved one away from you. All of these things are part of normal mourning that is a beautiful process. Again, here, Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning. I'm not sure if we would do that, but think about it. It takes time. You know what we tend to do here in the United States is everybody flies in from everywhere around, and everybody makes a big thing about the 1 or 2 days of the funeral. You know, sometimes they have a funeral and they bury him the next day. Everybody makes a big thing about those 1 or 2 days, and then everybody goes away. Well, I have news for you. The family is mourning for a lot longer than those 1 or 2 days. It takes time to get adjusted to that kind of a loss, especially if you're a family member. So Joseph took 7 days as a period of mourning. And I want you to notice the people living in the land of Canaan, the Canaanites, saw the mourning and made this comment. The Egyptians, they thought that Joseph looked a lot like an Egyptian because he had worked in Egypt for so long. So they say, the Egyptians are holding a ceremony of mourning. So they actually named the location the mourning of the Egyptians. These people have come here. They're obviously mourning a loved one. They're leaving the body here and then going back to Egypt. And then verse 12 to 14, he just gives a summary of the burial process. Jacob's sons kept their promise to their father, verse 12 and 13. They carried him to Canaan. They buried him in a cave. This was the cave that Abraham had bought as a burial place. And then secondly, Joseph kept his promise to Pharaoh, verse 14. He returned to Egypt, and the brothers returned, and all who had gone with them. So everything that was done in this whole process of mourning Jacob was done with love, with emotional freedom, and with integrity. Death, as I said before, is the most democratic experience in life. We all go through it. And let me say that each family needs to handle the details of death and burial in their own way. I never, as a pastor, tell people what to do at the funeral. That is for them to tell me how they want me to serve them. And by the way, it is considered unethical for a pastor to ask you for the opportunity to do your funeral. It is considered only that the family needs to ask the pastor. Just to let you know. That's how it's considered in pastoral ministry. The important thing is not the traditions that we hold about how we do death and burial. The important thing is that we honor God by the way we mourn our loved ones. And then I repeat that verse one more time from 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. We sorrow, but not as those without hope. Why? Because we know the hope of Christ. What is the hope of Christ? Well, the gospel. Paul says it in Corinthians very plainly. Christ died for our sins. He was buried according to the scriptures. And on the third day, he rose again. That's the gospel. That's the hope. And when we as Christians say goodbye to a loved one, somebody observed Christians and said, they carry their dead as if in triumph. That's the point. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. They carry their dead as if in triumph because they realize the truth of the gospel. And when we have our times of mourning for those we love, we need to do it in a way that honors God and is respectful of the one we say goodbye to. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord.